Hey, thanks for joining us today at Mount Pisgah Church. This morning, I'm continuing my series in the parables of Jesus, scandalous stories about a scandalous God. And today we're going to be talking about investing your life. Last week, we talked about the importance of being prepared and ready for the return of the Messiah or death, whichever one comes first. But in the meantime, while we wait, what are we supposed to be doing? Well, Jesus tells us we're supposed to be investing our lives. Again, if you have any prayer needs, please feel free to put them down in the comment section below. And if you're ever in the Apex, North Carolina area, please feel free to join us Sunday morning, 10 a.m., 1288 Mount Pisgah Church Road, Apex, North Carolina. We'd love to have you. Again, we're glad that you're with us. We pray the joy of the Lord will be your strength today. All right, we're going to go to back to Matthew 25 this morning, and we're going to be looking at the next story that Jesus told just before his passion would begin. And we're looking, as we've been looking at over the last month or so, at the parables of Jesus, scandalous stories about a scandalous God. And it's interesting, as I'm going through these and looking at them, they're such a revelation from the standpoint of people not understanding God and not understanding who He is and what He's like. And Jesus is teaching them truth that's radical to a lot of them, meaningful in so many respects, especially to certain groups of people among His culture, but laying out a spiritual truth about the Father through something He says or something He does, and then putting alongside it a story to highlight that and make it like a flower opening up to bear. It simplifies it in some respects where people can relate to it. And as we started looking last week in Matthew 25, this is in the context of Jesus having been asked, Lord, when are all these things going to happen, and what will be the sign of your coming of the end of the age? And in Matthew 24, Jesus spent a good portion of that talking about both near and far off prophetic things that were going to happen in the immediate future for Israel, for Jerusalem, to the Jewish people, and then future things that are going to happen in the world, and that would all precede His return. And then, as He closes that, and He's in that section talking about who is a wise and faithful servant in Matthew 24, He then starts in Matthew 25 and starts talking about wise virgins and foolish virgins. And we saw that last week, and the point of that whole parable was to be prepared and to be ready all the time. Live that way for one of two things, either for the imminence of death or His return. And that's the way you're to live, prepared and ready, having oil in your lamp, as He gave the illustration of the virgins for the wedding feast. And then He shifts into the story that we're going to look at this morning in Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. And He begins to talk about a master going away. And He says this. He says, "For it is like a man about to go on a journey. He called his own servants and handed over his possessions to them. To one He gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. Then he went on his journey. Immediately, the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more. In the same way, the one with 2 gained 2 more. But the one who received 1 went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought another 5 talents, saying, 'Master, you handed me 5 talents. Look, I've gained 5 more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a little, so I'll put you in charge of much. Enter into your master's joy.' The one who had received the 2 talents also came up and said, 'Master, you handed me 2 talents. Look, I've gained 2 more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a little, so I'll put you in charge of much. Enter into your master's joy.' Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came up and said, 'Master, I knew that you were a hard man, reaping where you didn't sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went off and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what's yours." But his master responded, "You wicked, lazy servant. You knew that I reap where I didn't sow, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you should have brought my money to the brokers, and when I came, I would have at least received it back with interest. Therefore, take the talent away from him. Give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to the one who has, more shall be given, and he shall have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw the worthless servant out into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Now, Jesus is building on each of these parables. And the next week, when we look at the final one here, he's going to add something to what he has said here and what we talked about last week about how we are to live being prepared. You know, you want to know that, well, Jesus said be prepared for death or for the imminence of his coming. How should we live? And he begins to tell us, this is how you're supposed to live your life. And then he gives examples through these two stories that he follows up with after the parable of the 10 virgins. Jesus is telling us, look, not only are you to be alert, not only are you to be watchful in the way you live your life, but you are now in this period to invest your lives into the lives of other people and to be faithful stewards of all that God has entrusted to you. Everything that God has entrusted to you, you're to be a faithful steward of it. Now, the thing we have to realize is the Scripture makes it very clear. Obviously, God is the creator of the whole creation. He's the creator of the universe. And the Psalms tell us that the cattle on 1,000 hills belong to the Lord. The cattle belong to him. But you say, wait, there's a rancher or a farmer that owns all those cattle. Well, yeah, he's got ownership in this world's eyes, but in reality, they belong to God. That farmer, that rancher, has only been entrusted with those things as a steward for the period of time he lives. And he's going to be responsible and accountable for what he does with that to God, because God has entrusted him with those things. Now, it's interesting that we've got these parables that tell us that we're to be ready and prepared. And he says, look, he's already told about a wise and faithful. So if you want to be wise and you want to be faithful, you need to know how to invest your life in the kingdom of God, in the things that matter, and be faithful stewards of everything he's entrusted to you and to me. Now, it's interesting when you compare the parables, the first one of the wise and foolish virgins and this parable, the wise and foolish virgins are women. In this parable of the stewards, it's men. In the parable of the 5 of the wise and foolish virgins, you have 10 who become 5. In this parable of the stewards, you have 5 that becomes 10. And then, of course, you have those who are faithful and those who are unfaithful, and both of them are set in a period of absence of someone waiting for a return. The bridegroom is absent, and so the wise or foolish virgins were waiting on his return, his coming to get his bride. In this parable, we have the stewards, the servants, whose master has gone away and is gone for a long time. And they are waiting for his return. Now, these parables are relatable to the people who are hearing them. The people who are listening, the Jewish people who are sitting around him, they understood being a servant of God, because Israel is referred to collectively as God's servant in Isaiah 41. And so, again, he's addressing Jewish people. He's admonishing them. And obviously, this has, as I said last week, it has application for all of us who follow him and those who do not, because everyone's going to give an account of their life. Every human being who has ever lived. And so the parable is showing us that there are different levels of responsibility that this landowner has given to each one of his servant. He gave 5 to one, 2 to another, and then 1 to another. And it's interesting that a talent, when we read this, sadly, in the West, we read the word talent and we start thinking about somebody's abilities. Oh, you've got a talent for this or you've got a talent for that. That's not what Jesus is talking about at all, even though it fits as well as an application in this parable. A talent was money. It was money. One talent was equal to about 17 to 20 years worth of wages for a human being at that time. One. Jesus is telling us that this landowner to the first guy basically gave that guy a lifetime of income to invest. Income that could be over 100 years that they would earn in this world. The second one basically got 50 years worth, and then the third one, the one who got the one talent, was given about 17 to 20 years worth of income. But they were given those things to use and invest for him. For him. But they were the ones that were entrusted with it to invest it. So when we hear the word talent, let's don't go down the road immediately of thinking about abilities that you and I have or that different people are given by God. Now, why did He give them each different measures of money? Different talents. Well, He felt compelled to delegate to each one a different amount of His possessions according to the ability of each servant. He looked at them and He knew, well, this one can handle the 5, this one can handle the 2, and this one can handle the 1. Notice that the 2 that did invest wisely with what He gave them were blessed with entering into the joy of the master and being made rulers over not just a little, but a lot. He doesn't say that the one that invested the 5 and made it 10 got more responsibility than the one that invested the 2 and made it 4. It didn't say that at all. It just says that, look, they got more and were blessed in a great way by the owner because of the way that they used the talents that He gave them. But each was given according to their ability. We're not to be comparing ourselves with other people as we go through this life. Thinking that, oh, well, because that person's got all of this stuff, they're doing all of these great things. A lot of people, think about, like when they think about, church and ministry and public figures, they look at somebody like a Billy Graham. And they think, well, Billy Graham traveled all over the world. And Billy Graham did all of these wonderful things and led all of these people to the Lord Jesus Christ. Certainly, he's probably going to have more than anybody else in the kingdom to come. That's not true. The guy that's traveled all over the world and preached to millions and millions of people, more than Jesus Himself ever preached to, or Paul ever preached to, and led so many people to Jesus Christ. The little old lady who was a maid all of her life and a servant to people that she worked for as a slave, but she was faithful to Jesus and did what God and used her life and invested her life for the kingdom of God, may have equal to or greater responsibility than Billy Graham in the kingdom to come, because of her faithfulness. All God is asking us to do, and what Jesus is saying is, what I've given to you, what I've entrusted you with in this period of you waiting for either death or my return, invest it wisely. And you will be rewarded richly by Him when He returns. Each one, even though they've been entrusted with different amounts, their actions resulted in proportional results. The one who had 5 immediately went out, invested it, made 5 more. The one who had 2 invested it, made 2 more. And of course, the servant who was given that single talent, his story is completely different in the sense that he goes out, digs a hole in the ground, hides the money. And some people listening to that may think, "Ooh, that was a smart move on his part, because he's not going to lose anything. You take those 5 out and invest them in the wrong way, you might lose them all. The 2, you might lose them. But the one who took that 1 talent and invested it in the sense of putting it in the ground in a lockbox more than likely, because that's what they would have used back then to bury things, and putting it away, he was smart because he wasn't going to lose it. And he would be able to give exactly back to the master what the master had given to them. But his problem was his actions were not what the master wanted him to do. And it's not too hard as you're reading through this at this point to say, this is pretty simple to understand what Jesus is talking about or what we should do with our lives. But then Jesus goes on, because up to this point when they're listening to the story, they're thinking, okay, it all makes sense so far, we get it. Then he shifts gears. And remember what I told you about parables. Parables are always a story, a riddle, or something to put or lay out alongside a spiritual truth. And the intent of the parable is to push people beyond their comfort zone. The intent of the people is to push them to a point of decision, of doing something. Jesus, when he asks questions in parables, most of the time never gives an answer. Most of the time, the parables are always open-ended when he comes to their conclusion because you don't know how the story completely or totally ends. This one you get an idea of how it's going to end, but he still leaves it because, again, the people who are listening are being pushed with the spiritual truth to a point of making a decision, what will I do with what I'm hearing now? What am I going to do with this truth that God has spoken to me in my heart? And so Jesus tells them that the master goes away for a very long time. And eventually he returns. And this is consistent with the understanding of the Messiah in Jewish thought. There were two different aspects of the Messiah's ministry. One, the Messiah would be Messiah ben Joseph, which had to do with his humanity. Isaiah 53, the Messianic Psalms. They knew that the Messiah would come, and in one sense of his coming, he would be a suffering servant. He would have to suffer in behalf, and he would die. After his resurrection, Jesus, of course, resurrected, ascended back to heaven, and he is there ruling and reigning until all of his enemies are made a footstool of his feet, according to the Psalms. And then he's going to return. But we know it's been almost over 2,000 years now since he's left the estate, as it were. We know that according to the Scriptures and obviously the things that Jesus tells us to be looking for, we're getting nearer and nearer to his return. But the second aspect of the Messiah, he would be Messiah ben David or David, that he's going to come back and rule. He would be a ruling king who would rule over all of creation. But here's the interesting thing. Jesus tells them in this parable that when the owner returns, he's returning for a very specific reason. He's returning to settle accounts with his servants. Each one of them is going to have to come and give an account to him of what they did with what he entrusted them with. And they're going to have something to show for it. The first servant approaches the owner. He points out that he'd earned 5 more with the 5 he invested. And the owner is ecstatic about that. He is so happy about it. He commends him for his wisdom. He commends this good and trustworthy servant. Since he was faithful within the master, the owner's eyes, who obviously is a very super wealthy man, he's going to say, look, you were entrusted with a little. Now, for the guy that got it, that's a whole lifetime's worth of wages. That was a lot to him. But the master, it was pennies. But he said, you know what? Because you were faithful, I am going to blow you away with what I'm getting ready to entrust you with, now give you. Because you are faithful over that little amount. So he's promised a large amount. And he's invited to come and to experience and participate in his master's happiness. Same thing happens with the servant who has the 2 talents. Again, he is ecstatic about what the servant done. He invites him into his joy, and he is going to reward him with greater responsibility and wealth than he ever dreamed. Excellent. You are a great and faithful servant, and I am going to let you enter into my happiness. But it's the last servant that gets the bulk of the attention of the parable here. Because his words and his attitude is completely different than the other two. And here's the thing. In Jesus' day, lending money, giving someone money was a very common thing. But most of the time, it was done through temples in a lot of the different cultures. Because temples not only served as a place of worship, they also doubled as a bank in those cultures. Rome, same thing. So you could take money, silver, gold, and you could deposit them there, and they were considered safe. They were considered protected. And so since not a whole lot of people had a whole lot of capital, those who did, they could lend money at significant interest. And as a result, an investor could often receive 10 times more than what they originally invested. At the very least, they could double their investment in such a setting. And so the guy that gets the one talent, and see, the people that are listening to Jesus, they know this. So the guy that gets the one talent, you could have expected him to at least have matched the amount given him, simply by taking it to a temple and putting it there for safekeeping. But he didn't do that at all. He starts his explanation out when he's called to give an account on shaky ground already. He's addressing, and this is what he does. He addresses his master as a hard man. I knew you were a hard man to please. And then, after he gives this negative greeting to the landowner, he then continues by denigrating the master, by telling him, look, you harvest where you didn't plant, and you gather where you didn't sow. And so because of his perceptions of his master, the final servant admits that he was afraid of the owner. So much that he just hid that talent in the ground. And with that kind of an attitude, the servant just comes and he opens his little lockbox and says, here's your talent back. And with no profit, no labor to show for it. Now, when the people who are listening to Jesus hear this, it shocks them, obviously. They're surprised by what this guy did, because they knew that what this servant had just done was insult the landowner. He has insulted his master. Basically, what he's doing is he is blaming the master's harsh character for his own failure to increase his master's investment. Blaming him. It's your fault because you're a hard man to please. Not my fault. It's your fault. And the people who are listening to this say, that's not right. Completely out of line here, this guy. And so the master, Jesus says, he's not at all pleased with the attitudes and the actions, and he rebukes the man as a wicked, not just bad, a wicked and lazy servant. He marvels at the observations that are unfair from the servant about him. You see, because he's the master, he has a right to harvest wherever he wants to on his property. And to gather on his property wherever he didn't even sow seed. He has a right because it belongs to him. Who's this little fella telling me I don't have a right to do what I want to with what's mine? But nonetheless, that's what the servant did. I mean, he owns the place. And see, the servant knows this. So it makes all the sense in the world that he should have at least taken that one talent and gone and deposited it with the bankers. Because at least it would have gained some interest on the investment. Because of his irresponsible actions, Jesus tells the people, look, the master directs the other people to take away that one talent from him and give it to the one who has 10. Now again, everybody that's listening think, wait a minute, this dude's got 10. He doesn't need more. Again, the kingdom doesn't work like how we think it works. Remember, God is not fair, but He is good. We're not talking about fairness when it comes to the kingdom. We're talking about God doing with what He wants to do with what actually belongs to Him. But that's fair and that's just according to Jesus and the story. And so the master is quoted as saying, everyone who has something will be given more so that he will have more than enough. The faithful servant will be blessed even beyond his immediate added responsibilities, and that blessing will come in a surprising way to them. And anyone who has nothing, even what he does have will be taken away. Even with the great loss, there's more ramifications for the unfaithful, untrusting worker. The master then tells the other servants to apprehend this worthless servant and throw him out into the dark. Lifetimes of wages entrusted to servants by a good master who's simply asking them to use what He's given them so that when He returns, He'll have a return on His investment in them. Jesus is making a point. Obviously, one of the points is good stewardship is going to result in great blessing and great responsibility to come. Sometimes that great blessing and great responsibility isn't going to wait until He returns. Sometimes He gives us more in this life. You're faithful with little, I'm going to trust you now with a little bit more. See what you do with that. Faithful with that, I'm going to trust you with a little bit more. See what you do with that. But ultimately, there is coming the day, by death or by His return, when every one of us will stand face to face to give an account, an accounting with what we did, with all that He entrusted to us for the sake of His kingdom. And again, there's not going to be a place for excuses in that moment. Because we're going to be standing before one who knows everything. Everything. Our motives, our opportunities. There's not going to be any wiggle room for anybody in this accounting. And we're going to know that when we're standing giving, there's no place to hide. Mommy and Daddy aren't going to be standing by there holding our hands saying, it's going to be all right, sweetie. Now you don't need to be afraid or scared. And please just be kind. No. One-on-one, face-to-face, and accounting. What did you do with what I gave to you? How did you invest it as you waited for meeting and while you were waiting to meet me? Now, Jesus closes this parable with these symbols of cast this servant into outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, tragically, for most of us in the West, especially since the time of Augustine, and especially since the time of the prior to and just during the Reformation back in the 1500s, when we read that statement, weeping and gnashing of teeth, what do we think about immediately? Hell. We're going to throw them into hell. The people who are listening to Jesus were not thinking about hell. Because these two phrases were common things that they understood. They understood them as negative things, not good things, bad things, but they were consequences. Consequences of wrong actions. But when you read the Hebrew Scriptures and understand how these terms were used, especially in the Old Testament, you begin to get an understanding that they represent and symbolize most of the time envy, anguish, despair, and frustration. When you go back into the Scriptures, Psalm 35:16, with godless mockery they gnashed their teeth at me, David writes. The gnashing of teeth here is depicted as an expression of animosity and derision from David's enemies. They're mocking him while they're gnashing. Gnashing is the grinding of the teeth. They're mocking him while they're gnashing their teeth at David. It's expressing severe disdain toward David and a viciousness toward him, stemming from their feelings probably of great jealousy toward him as a king. Then in Psalm 37:12, he writes, "The wicked plot against the righteous and gnash their teeth at them." The wicked here are depicted as gnashing their teeth at the righteous because they're conspiring against the righteous. It seems to symbolize here envy and jealousy on their part. Then in Psalm 112, verse 10, it says, "The wicked man will see and be vexed. He will gnash his teeth and waste away. The desire of the wicked will perish." Here it symbolizes frustration, a helpless rage of the wicked. Again, stemming probably from jealousy as they're witnessing the success and the blessing of those who are righteous. They're consumed with envy, they're consumed with jealousy, and that leads them to gnash their teeth at the righteous. All of these passages here are associated with negative emotions. And again, envy, jealousy, and frustration. There's mental and emotional responses rather than physical pain. See, we in the West, we immediately read hell into this and say, see, when people go into hell, they're going to be gnashing their teeth. That's not what he's talking about. This is emotional expressions of envy, jealousy, hatred toward the righteous. Very strong emotions, frustrations. And so when these people are hearing this, they immediately know and are associating this whole concept of gnashing of teeth. Rather than describing the fate of the wicked in judgments to come in the future, it's a state of profound, as one writer says, emotional and psychological distress that possibly resembles the feelings of envy, jealousy, or regret. When Stephen was being tried before the Sanhedrin, the members of the Sanhedrin were so frustrated at what he was saying, it says that they came and they gnashed their teeth at him. So gnashing of teeth is not associated here or in the Scriptures leading up to this parable with physical pain or suffering. It is all about emotions: envy, jealousy, regret, frustration. It's sort of like, as one person said, the ancient version of the fear of missing out. Something good has happened and you have missed out on it. You were not in the know. An apprehension of missing out on events or experiences or life decisions that could have made your life better, but you missed out on it. Think about this. My wife and I have joked about it in times. I remember way back when Amazon was just starting and the stock was like pennies compared on the dollar. Or Bitcoin. When Bitcoin started, everybody laughed at it and thought it was so stupid and so dumb. And I remember thinking about even that, at the same thing at that time, how ridiculous all of this is. And you could have bought hundreds or thousands of those things for a very minimal, light investment. And now look at it. Can you imagine if you just bought 100 of those things? And it wouldn't cost you hardly anything out of your pocket to do it then. You'd be a multi-millionaire now. You think about, oh, I missed out. Now, we're not gnashing our teeth at that, per se. But there have been a lot of people who probably did, who thought they were given an opportunity to invest in something and they didn't because of fear and the risk that they thought was involved. And then all of a sudden it turned around and bam, if I'd only done that, look at where I'd be now. Missing out. The emotional sting that comes from what you could have had, what you could have done, what you could have experienced had you just made a different decision is a painful one. And this is what Jesus is trying to get across to the people. It's going to be painful one day when you stand and have to give an account and realize what could have been and wasn't. You could have had all of this had you used what I entrusted to you how I wanted you to use it. Had you invested it in me and in my kingdom. Again, this parable is not about people trembling because they're going to be whipped endlessly in hellfire. It's about regret. The rewards and honor they could have secured had they chosen differently in this life to do different things. They missed their opportunity to collect significant rewards in God's kingdom. In this life, every day that you and I are given to live, we are given a unique opportunity by God to gather rewards and to gather treasures that will await us in the world to come. You can spend your money, for example, on a luxury yacht if you want to, or you can invest it in spiritual things by feeding the poor, building wells for people who are less fortunate, or putting a roof over somebody's head who doesn't have one, or spreading the gospel of the kingdom to other nations who have yet to hear. Now, there's nothing wrong with investing or using financial means that God gives you for things that you might enjoy. But again, ultimately, you have to remember, when we talked about this months ago, when we talked about using our finances and giving as God would have us to, first and foremost, we entrust all that we have to God, and what we do with it is up to Him. And before we invest it, we need to say, is this what you want me to do with this? I've got this extra. I'd like to buy a boat, Lord. Is it okay? Or do you have something else that you'd like for me to do with this money? Or I have this extra time. I would like to do this or whatever. How do you want me to use this? Lord, and you're asking God, again, we're following the leadership of the Holy Spirit and how He wants us to invest our life. Not how we just automatically, put God in this little corner over here, and when we choose to ask Him about certain things, we go to Him, but the rest of it, we just do what we want. It's not how we live our lives as believers following Christ. Our lives are to be used to follow Him and to invest it in everything He entrusts us with into His kingdom. You're going to reap a great return. He promises you that. If you invest your life and all that He entrusts you with in His will, His ways, and in His kingdom. Remember, Jesus said, do not store up for yourself treasures on this earth. Don't do it, He says. Because moths and vermin can destroy it, where thieves can break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where the moths and vermin don't destroy, where thieves don't break in and steal it. For where your treasure is, that's where your heart is going to be also. What about this outer darkness business? Because again, we automatically think about outer darkness, but yet we don't logically think through what we're saying. We in the West think hell. Hell. People are going to be thrown into hell. Is fire dark? What does fire produce? Light. But Jesus is talking about darkness here. He's not talking about fire. He's talking about a darkness that is outside of something. It can signify, symbolize, as it does in the Old Testament, despair, ignorance, or being in a condition of being excluded from God's protection and God's blessing. Even in the Torah, in Deuteronomy 28, verse 29, God tells Israel, when they disobey and break covenant with Him, you will grope at noonday as a blind man gropes in darkness. You'll not prosper in your ways. You will be only oppressed and plundered continually, and no one will save you. In the New Testament, this whole concept of outer darkness, as the people are listening to this, can be a metaphor for exclusion. You miss out. Exclusion from a banquet. exclusion from a celebration. In Israel in those days, remember, there weren't power poles and electricity running all over the country. And when someone threw a great party or a great banquet, just like today, most of the time it's usually at night, and in that place, all the light would be focused. If you were excluded from that celebration and put out of the city, where were you? In what? Darkness. Outside. You were not able to participate in the great celebration that was taking place. Being outside of a kingdom during those days meant complete darkness. And being in outer darkness, that you were excluded from the joy and the happiness and the light-filled celebration. So when Jesus is telling these people He's going to experience weeping and gnashing of teeth, He's going to experience profound frustration, probably because He's excluded from the party. He can't experience what everybody else is experiencing. He's not going to get to participate in that. He's what we would maybe modernly say, he's being kept in the dark. Everybody else is in on it. He's not. Doesn't mean he's going to be tortured forever. It's not what Jesus is talking about. Just simply means you were not considered worthy to be invited to the banquet. You missed it. So we sit back and we think Jesus closes this with that statement. Of course, then he's going to go into something else to make an application of this parable in the next story. We ask you, what's the point, Jesus? Well, the point is this. Not only are you to live prepared and ready, but you need to invest your life in service to the King and His kingdom. That involves obedience to Him. That involves loving God and loving other people. Don't come to the end of your life and find yourself staring at a life of regret. A life of anguish over what you could have done and did not do, or what you did do that was not God's best for you. So you feel as though life was wasted. How many of us, I have thought at times when we're alone with ourselves and look back over our life and think, I wish I could go back and change things. I wish I had done it differently then. I wish I had said it differently then. I wish I had gone through that door that was open for me and I didn't. I wish I could go back and do something different. And Jesus is saying, don't come to the end of your life filled with those kind of things. The actions of each servant, and here's the key, was based on their understanding and knowledge of the wealthy landowner. Two of them operated from a position of fear of him, but not a terrorizing fear, but one of reverence, awe, and love for him, because they knew him. They knew him. The other one operated out of fear and ignorance of him. Just like the virgins didn't know the bridegroom and the bridegroom didn't know them, this last servant didn't know his master or his heart. You see how all these parables, many of them are pointing to the fact that people, you don't get my Father. You don't understand Him. You don't know Him. And I'm trying to get you through these stories to do just that. Each servant had to be willing to do something that no human being likes to do for the most part in the natural. Take a risk. That would require action on their part and trust with what the owner entrusted to them. What does fear do? Fear paralyzes you. Keeps you from taking action. These first two who invested were willing to take the risk for the sake of their master, so that he would be blessed when He returned. Jesus is saying, look, guys, put into action everything that God has entrusted to you in service to Him and other people. Do not waste your life and end it with regret. Don't do that. How do we do this? First and foremost, as I said a while ago, you and I submit all that we are and all that we have to God. Lord, here's my life. Here are my possessions, my money, my gifts, the abilities you've given to me, the opportunities, everything, they belong to you. I'm entrusting them to you. I'm following you. You lead me. Then, God, now that it belongs to you and I acknowledge it belongs to you, it does whether I acknowledge it or not, but I'm acknowledging that and I'm yielding that willingly to you. What do you want me to do with it all? How do you want me to use the life that you've given to me? And then, as an individual, God has made each one of us unique, and we need to discover what He has put into our hearts individually of what He wants us to do in following Him. How has He wired us? The answering the question, what would you do if you knew you could not and would not fail? What would you do if you knew failure was an impossibility? Find out where your heart is at. What has God ignited in you and given you a passion to do? I love this quote of Frederick Buechner. He says, the place where God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. You find great joy and satisfaction in doing it, and there's a world out there that's hungry and thirsty for it, and those two come together. Howard Thurman said, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and go do that, because what the world needs is people who've come alive. What makes you tick? John Eldridge, who wrote the book Wild at Heart, said when he read that quote by Thurman, he said, I was struck dumb. It could have been at Balaam's donkey for all I was concerned. Suddenly, my life up to that point made sense in a sickening sort of way. I realized I was living a script written for me by someone else. All my life, I had been asking the world to tell me what to do with myself. This is different from seeking counsel or advice. What I wanted was freedom from responsibility and especially freedom from risk. I wanted someone else to tell me who to be. Thank God it didn't work. The scripts they handed to me, I simply could not bring myself to play for very long. Like Saul's armor, they never fit. Can a world of posers tell you to do anything but pose yourself? As Buechner said, we're in constant danger of not actors in the drama of our lives, but reactors. To go where the world takes us, to drift with whatever current happens to be running the strongest. Reading the counsel Thurman gave to Baal, I knew it was God speaking to me. It was an invitation to come out of Ur, like Abraham, follow Him. What is going on in my life and in your life right now? Who has written the script for your life? And again, you sit here and think, well, I'm, beyond this age or that age or whatever. Your life is not over yet. You're still breathing. You're still functioning in this world, and God is not through with you yet, and it's never too late. Until one of those two things happens. Death or He returns. Then it's too late. You don't have a second chance to start living the way He wants you to. You've got it today. You have the opportunity. How can it change? The Bible is full of people who took risks. Look at everybody that followed God. You tell me one that didn't take a risk when they did. Jesus even said, when you follow me, it's going to cost you everything. Be ready to die. Risk. Going out into the unknown. Investing their lives following God. I cannot control risk out of my life if I follow Jesus. It's going to require me to trust Him and the willingness to do like Peter, get out of the boat and walk on water. Not be afraid. What makes you come alive? Again, if you could do anything and not fail, what would it be? And that's not a foolish thing. Well, I will do this, go play, this or do that, those kind of things. We can get a little wacky with some of that. What I'm saying is being in the sense before God. God, what do you want me to do? What have you given me a passion for in my life? What would I love to get up and do morning, noon, and night, and do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the sake of your kingdom that just brings me great satisfaction? If you had permission to do what you wanted to do, what would you do? And here's the big thing as I close. Do not ever ask how. The how is God's business. All you have to do is ask what. That's it. Then leave the how up to God. Sometimes the how comes quickly. Sometimes it takes years in the developing. But He's still moving you along. And as you're moving along, you continue to be faithful to Him in the little things. Until He gets you to the point of where, okay, now I can entrust you with this. You're ready. It's time. Step into it. But you started back here with the what? Investing your life. Don't come to the end of your life and be like this final servant, filled with regret, missing out on a celebration that could have been had you only asked God, what do you want me to do? Here I am. And then obeyed as He spoke to you and led you to do it. Jesus, thank you for giving this story to us, and thank you for the opportunity to follow you. Help all of us in here to examine our hearts, to examine our lives, to examine all the things you've entrusted to us in this world to use them for the sake of your kingdom. Yes, our abilities. Yes, our gifts. Yes, our money. Yes, the possessions you've entrusted to us. They belong to you. Father, help us to turn our 5 into 10, our 2 into 4, but please don't let us take it and bury it and waste it. Help us to be faithful as we wait for death or for your return. In Jesus' name, amen. As Kenny's coming, you remember Aesop's fables? Remember reading those in school? They were around already when Jesus was teaching. And there was a little story he told about a man who had a big gold rock. And he says, the man took this big gold rock, and because it was worth so much, he took it and buried it. And you know what? Thieves found out where it was at, dug it up, carried it away. And the man was just exasperated the fact that he'd lost that rock of gold. Someone came along and said, you know what? I'll tell you what to do to get over your exasperation. Go get you another big rock and bury it there and leave it alone. Because that rock that's buried there will do you just as much good as the gold that you had buried there and we're not using. Think about that.